Your time is up, old lady. Pack your desk and get out before security escorts you. Marcus Wellington's voice carried across the entire accounting department like a death sentence. I stood there, frozen, my coffee mug still warm in my hands, watching 23 years of my career crumble in front of my colleagues. The smirk on his face told me everything I needed to know. He'd been planning this moment for months, and he was savoring every second of my humiliation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Peterson and Associates seemed brighter that Tuesday morning, casting harsh shadows across my desk as I processed what had just happened. 23 years. 2 decades of arriving early, staying late, covering for colleagues, training new hires, and maintaining the financial records that kept this mid-sized accounting firm running smoothly. And it was ending with Marcus Wellington, a man 15 years my junior, standing over me with a termination letter and the kind of satisfied expression usually reserved for people who'd just won the lottery. My name is Catherine Rivera, and at 58, I thought I understood how the world worked. I thought loyalty mattered. I thought experience counted for something. I thought that showing up every day for over 2 decades, building relationships with clients, mentoring younger staff, and maintaining an impeccable record would provide some measure of job security. I was about to learn how naive that thinking really was. The termination letter was brief, clinical, and devastating. Due to restructuring and modernization efforts, your position has been eliminated effective immediately. No mention of my perfect attendance record. No acknowledgement of the countless hours I'd spent training Marcus himself when he'd arrived 18 months ago, fresh out of business school with an MBA and an attitude that suggested the world owed him everything. No recognition of the fact that I'd personally saved 3 major client accounts from leaving the firm last year when their previous accountant had made critical errors. Marcus had been hired as the new senior financial analyst, a position that technically placed him above me in the hierarchy, despite my years of experience. From his first day, he'd made it clear that he viewed me as a relic, a dinosaur who couldn't adapt to modern accounting software and contemporary business practices. Never mind that I'd been using advanced financial software since before he'd graduated high school. Never mind that I'd successfully transitioned through 4 major system upgrades during my tenure. Never mind that several clients specifically requested to work with me because they trusted my expertise and attention to detail. The morning had started like any other. I'd arrived at 7:30, 30 minutes before my official start time, because I liked having those quiet moments to organize my day and review any urgent emails that might have come in overnight. The office was always peaceful at that hour, just the hum of computers and the distant sound of the cleaning crew finishing their work. I'd made my usual pot of coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, and settled into my desk to review the quarterly reports that were due by the end of the week. I should have noticed that Marcus was already in his office when I arrived. That was unusual because he typically rolled in around 9, sometimes later, claiming that he worked better when he could ease into his day without the stress of rushing. I should have paid attention to the fact that he'd been having hushed phone conversations for the past several weeks, always stepping away from his desk when he noticed me nearby. I should have been more suspicious when he'd started asking detailed questions about my client relationships, my project timelines, and my knowledge of various accounts. But I'd attributed all of that to ambition. Marcus was clearly eager to advance in the company, and I'd actually been impressed that he was finally showing initiative and interest in understanding the broader scope of our department's operations. I'd been generous with my time and knowledge, explaining complex client histories, sharing insights I'd gained over years of relationship building, and even covering for him when he'd made mistakes during his first few months on the job. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat there, holding my termination letter. I'd trained my own replacement. I'd handed him everything he needed to succeed, and he'd used that knowledge to convince management that I was redundant. The breadth of my responsibilities, the depth of my client relationships, the institutional knowledge I'd accumulated over more than 2 decades. Marcus had systematically learned it all, documented it, and then presented it to upper management as evidence that he could handle my workload in addition to his own. "Catherine, I need you to clean out your desk immediately," Marcus said, his voice loud enough to ensure that everyone in the department could hear. Security will escort you out when you're finished. The security escort was an especially humiliating touch. As if I might steal office supplies or sabotage computer systems on my way out. As if a woman who'd never had so much as a written reprimand in 23 years of employment might suddenly turn into a corporate terrorist. My colleagues pretended to be absorbed in their work, but I could feel their eyes on me. Sarah from payroll looked stricken, her hand covering her mouth in shock. David from accounts receivable had stopped typing entirely and was staring at his computer screen with an expression of disbelief. Jennifer, the newest hire who I'd been mentoring for the past 6 months, looked like she might cry. But none of them said anything. None of them protested. They all just watched as I began the humiliating process of packing my personal belongings into a cardboard box. The contents of my desk told the story of a career that had been more than just a job. Photographs of my daughter's graduation, my grandchildren's school plays, office holiday parties from years past, a small cactus plant that had somehow survived on my windowsill for 8 years despite my notorious inability to keep plants alive, a coffee mug with World's Best Grandmother that my grandson had given me last Christmas, a stack of thank you cards from clients who'd appreciated my work over the years, small tokens of a professional life that had provided not just income, but identity, purpose, and community. "Take your time," Marcus said, but his tone suggested the opposite. He was standing close enough to monitor my every movement, making sure I didn't take anything that might be considered company property. When I reached for a file folder that contained notes from a recent client meeting, he stepped forward. "That stays here. Company materials don't leave the premises." The notes were in my handwriting, based on my conversations, reflecting my analysis and recommendations. But technically, he was right. They belonged to Peterson and Associates, not to me. As I packed, fragments of memories from my years at the firm flashed through my mind. My first day, when I'd been so nervous about impressing my new colleagues that I'd arrived an hour early and sat in my car in the parking lot, practicing my introduction. The time I'd worked through the night to fix a critical error in a client's tax filing, saving them thousands in penalties, and preserving their relationship with the firm. The countless birthday celebrations, retirement parties, and holiday gatherings where I'd felt like part of a professional family. I remembered training Marcus during his first week, how eager he'd seemed to learn, how grateful he'd appeared when I'd taken extra time to explain the complexities of our client management system. He'd been charming then, deferential, quick to acknowledge that I had knowledge and experience he lacked. He'd brought me coffee, complimented my organizational skills, and even asked for my advice on how to build rapport with difficult clients. I'd been flattered by his.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Attention, and impressed by his apparent humility. The transformation had been gradual. As Marcus became more comfortable in his role, his deference had shifted to confidence, then to arrogance. He'd started questioning my methods, suggesting that my approaches were outdated, implying that his fresh perspective and modern training made him more valuable to the firm. During team meetings, he'd begun interrupting me, talking over my presentations, and dismissing my suggestions with phrases like, "That's how things used to be done," or, "We need to think more strategically about this." I'd initially tried to view his behavior as enthusiasm rather than disrespect. Young professionals often needed to prove themselves, and I'd assumed his attitude would moderate as he gained experience and confidence. I'd continued to support him, sharing my knowledge freely and defending his ideas to senior management when I thought they had merit. I'd even recommended him for additional responsibilities when he'd expressed interest in taking on more complex projects. The cardboard box was nearly full when I found the folder containing my performance reviews from the past 5 years. Every single one rated my work as exceeds expectations or outstanding. My client satisfaction scores were consistently among the highest in the department. My error rate was virtually 0. My collaboration ratings reflected the respect and appreciation of my colleagues. Marcus had access to all of this information when he'd made his case to management for my elimination. He'd known exactly how valuable I was to the firm, and he'd eliminated me anyway. "Are you almost finished?" Marcus asked, tapping his watch. "The security guard has other responsibilities." I looked up at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since this nightmare had begun. He was young, conventionally handsome in the way that suggested good genetics and expensive grooming. His suit was perfectly tailored, his hair precisely styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about his appearance conveyed success, ambition, and confidence. But his eyes, I realized, were cold. There was no warmth there, no empathy, no recognition that he was destroying another human being's livelihood and dignity. "Marcus," I said quietly, "can I ask you something?" He nodded, though his expression suggested impatience. "Why did you do this? I helped you succeed here. I taught you everything you needed to know about our systems, our clients, our procedures. Why did you decide I needed to be eliminated?" For a moment, his mask slipped. The polished professional facade cracked just enough to reveal something ugly underneath. "Catherine, you're a nice woman, but you're from a different era. Your methods are antiquated. Your technology skills are limited. Your understanding of modern business practices is superficial. The firm needs fresh thinking, innovative approaches, strategic vision. We can't afford to carry deadweight just because someone's been here for a long time." The words hit me like physical blows. Deadweight. After 23 years of dedicated service, after countless late nights and weekend emergencies, after building relationships that had generated millions in revenue for the firm, I was deadweight. "But my performance reviews," I began, "my client relationships, my track record of success." Marcus shrugged. "Past performance doesn't guarantee future value. The business world is changing rapidly. We need people who can adapt, who can think outside traditional frameworks, who can bring cutting-edge perspectives to complex problems. I'm not saying you haven't contributed to this firm, but your time here has run its course. It's time for fresh blood, new ideas, contemporary leadership." I finished packing in silence. There was nothing left to say. Marcus had made his position clear, and arguing with him would only prolong the humiliation. The security guard, a kind-looking man named Ray, who I'd chatted with countless times over the years, appeared at my desk with an expression of genuine regret. "I'm really sorry about this, Mrs. Rivera," he said quietly. "This doesn't seem right." Ray's sympathy was the first human kindness I'd experienced since this ordeal began, and it nearly broke me. I managed to hold back tears until we reached the elevator, but as the doors closed on the office that had been my second home for more than 2 decades, I finally allowed myself to cry. Ray pretended not to notice, focusing intently on the floor numbers as we descended to the parking garage. The drive home was a blur of disbelief and devastation. I'd left the house that morning as Catherine Rivera, senior financial analyst at Peterson & Associates, a respected professional with a stable career and a secure future. I was returning as Catherine Rivera, unemployed 58-year-old woman with uncertain prospects and a profound sense of betrayal. The transition had taken less than 30 minutes, but it felt like my entire identity had been erased. My daughter Elena called that evening, her voice bright with excitement about a promotion she'd received at her marketing firm. I listened to her enthusiasm, her plans for celebration, her gratitude for the career advice I'd given her over the years. When she finally asked about my day, I couldn't bring myself to tell her what had happened. Instead, I murmured something about it being routine and asked more questions about her success. She deserved to enjoy her triumph without worrying about her mother's professional disaster. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I'd had with Marcus over the past 18 months. I searched for signs I'd missed, warnings I'd ignored, red flags that might have prepared me for this betrayal. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how carefully orchestrated his campaign had been. He hadn't just stumbled into an opportunity to eliminate me. He'd created that opportunity through months of strategic planning and careful manipulation. The documentation he'd compiled about my responsibilities hadn't been born from curiosity or eagerness to learn. It had been reconnaissance. The questions he'd asked about client relationships hadn't reflected professional development interests. They'd been intelligence gathering. The times he'd volunteered to help with my projects hadn't demonstrated team spirit. They'd been opportunities to learn my processes well enough to replicate them. I thought about all the knowledge I'd shared so freely, all the shortcuts and insights I'd taught him, all the client quirks and preferences I'd explained in detail. Marcus now possessed decades of my professional wisdom, and he'd used that knowledge to convince management that I was expendable. It was a masterpiece of corporate manipulation, and I'd been completely blind to it until it was too late. The worst part was the realization that I'd facilitated my own destruction. Every training session where I'd shared my expertise, every client introduction where I'd vouched for his competence, every time I'd covered for his mistakes or credited him with joint successes, had strengthened his position while weakening mine. I'd been generous with my knowledge because I'd believed we were working toward shared goals. He'd been collecting my knowledge because he'd been planning to replace me. 3 days after my termination, I received a call from Linda Morrison, one of my longtime clients. She'd heard about my departure and was deeply concerned. "Catherine, what happened?" Marcus called to tell me he'd be handling my account going forward, but he couldn't answer basic questions about my portfolio. He didn't seem to understand the tax strategy we've been implementing, and he had no knowledge of the estate planning issues we've been addressing. How is he supposed to manage my affairs if he doesn't understand the foundation we've built over the past 8 years? That conversation was the first hint that Marcus might have overestimated his ability to seamlessly step into my role. Over the following weeks, I received similar calls from other clients. They were frustrated by his lack of institutional knowledge, concerned about his unfamiliarity with their specific situations, and disappointed by the impersonal approach he was taking to client relationships. Several mentioned that they were considering switching to other firms if the quality of service didn't improve quickly. I was professionally obligated to be diplomatic in my responses to these calls. I couldn't criticize Marcus or Peterson and Associates without risking potential legal consequences. But I also couldn't help feeling a small measure of satisfaction knowing that his grand plan might not be working as smoothly as he'd anticipated. The clients weren't just business relationships to me. They were people I'd worked with for years, individuals whose financial goals and personal situations I understood intimately. Marcus might have learned the technical aspects of managing their accounts, but he hadn't inherited the trust and rapport that had taken years to build. 2 weeks after my termination, I had lunch with Sarah from payroll. She'd reached out privately, expressing concern about my well-being and curiosity about my future plans. Over salads at a small cafe downtown, she shared some interesting information about the changes happening at Peterson and Associates since my departure. "Things are not going well in your old department," she said, lowering her voice despite the fact that we were nowhere near the office. "Marcus is struggling to keep up with everything. He's working late every night, coming in on weekends, and he still can't seem to manage the workload effectively." Sarah continued, "3 clients have already complained to management about the quality of service they're receiving. The Morrison account is threatening to leave if they don't get better support. The Henderson portfolio review was supposed to be completed last week, but Marcus hasn't even started it. And yesterday, he made a significant error in the Johnson tax filing that David had to fix before it went out." The picture she painted was of a department in chaos, with Marcus drowning in responsibilities he'd convinced management he could handle with ease. "The partners are starting to ask questions," Sarah added. "They're wondering why they need to hire additional staff to cover work that you used to manage single-handedly. Marcus keeps requesting assistance, claiming that the client demands have increased significantly since your departure. But the partners know that's not true. They're beginning to realize that maybe eliminating your position wasn't the strategic move Marcus had convinced them it would be." As I drove home from lunch with Sarah, I felt the first stirring of something I hadn't experienced since my termination. Not quite hope, but possibility. Marcus had gambled that he could absorb my responsibilities without any decline in service quality or efficiency. He'd assured management that his modern approaches and strategic thinking would actually improve departmental performance. But the reality was proving very different from his promises. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since being fired. I updated my resume and began researching job opportunities in the area. Not because I was desperate to find another position immediately, but because I was starting to think about what I wanted my next chapter to look like. For the first time since that humiliating Tuesday morning, I was beginning to feel like Catherine Rivera, experienced financial professional, rather than Catherine Rivera, discarded old lady. The phone call that changed everything came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after my termination. The caller ID showed Peterson and Associates, and for a moment I considered not answering. But curiosity won out. Catherine? This is James Peterson, the founding partner of the firm, a man I'd interacted with countless times over the years but who rarely called employees directly. Catherine, I hope you're well. I was wondering if you might have time to meet with me this week. There are some issues I'd like to discuss with you. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon in James Peterson's corner office, a space I'd been in only a handful of times during my tenure at the firm. The office reflected old-school, professional success, rich mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, framed degrees and certifications, photographs with local business leaders and politicians. James Peterson was in his 70s, a man who'd built the firm from a small neighborhood practice into one of the most respected accounting firms in the region. Catherine, he said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from his desk, I want to apologize for the abrupt manner of your departure. I've been reviewing the circumstances surrounding your termination, and I have some concerns about how the situation was handled. His words were careful, measured, but I could hear genuine regret in his voice. I've also been reviewing the performance of our department since your departure, and I'm troubled by what I've discovered. He opened a file folder and began sharing details that confirmed everything Sarah had told me, plus additional problems I hadn't heard about. Client complaints had increased dramatically, project deadlines were being missed regularly, the quality of work product had declined noticeably. Other staff members were being asked to work overtime consistently to cover gaps in service delivery. And Marcus, despite his confident assurances that he could handle expanded responsibilities, was clearly overwhelmed and struggling to meet basic performance expectations. The partners and I have concluded that eliminating your position was a mistake, James Peterson continued. Your departure has created significant operational challenges that we hadn't anticipated. We underestimated the breadth of your contributions and the depth of your client relationships. We also overestimated Marcus's ability to absorb your responsibilities while maintaining his own performance standards. He paused, studying my expression carefully. Catherine, I'd like to offer you the opportunity to return to Peterson and Associates. Not to your previous position, but to a newly created role as Senior Client Relations Manager. The position would involve oversight of our most important client accounts, mentoring of junior staff, and strategic consultation on complex financial matters. The salary would be substantially higher than your previous compensation, and you'd report directly to the partners rather than through departmental management. I sat in silence for several moments, processing what he'd just offered. A triumphant return to Peterson and Associates, vindication of my value to the firm, recognition of my expertise and experience. It was more than I'd dared to hope for 3 weeks ago, but something held me back from immediately accepting. James, what about Marcus? How would this arrangement work given his role in my original termination? James Peterson's expression grew stern. Marcus's employment with Peterson and Associates has been terminated. His misrepresentation of his capabilities, his failure to maintain service standards, and his role in creating the current crisis have led us to conclude that he's not a good fit for our organization. We've also discovered some discrepancies in his expense reports and questions about his billing practices that require further investigation. The room fell silent as I absorbed this information. Marcus Wellington, the ambitious young professional who'd orchestrated my humiliation and elimination, had lasted less than a month in my expanded role before his own inadequacies became impossible to ignore. The man who'd called me deadweight had proven himself incapable of handling the responsibilities he'd convinced management he could master. I appreciate the offer, James, I said finally, but I need some time to consider it. This has been a difficult period, and I want to make sure I'm making the right decision for my future. He nodded understandingly. Of course. Take all the time you need. The position will remain open until you're ready to give me an answer. As I drove home from that meeting, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly. Satisfaction at Marcus's downfall, absolutely. But also a strange sense of empowerment that I hadn't expected. For the first time in my professional life, I held all the cards. Peterson and Associates needed me more than I needed them. I could return on my own terms, with better compensation and greater authority than I'd ever had before. Or I could walk away entirely, confident in the knowledge that my value had been proven beyond question. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Peterson and Associates and asked to speak with James Peterson. When he came on the line, I delivered my answer with more confidence than I'd felt in years. James, I've decided to accept your offer, but with one additional condition. I want Marcus's termination to be handled publicly, with the same lack of dignity and privacy that characterized my departure. I want him to experience the humiliation of being escorted out by security while his colleagues watch. I want him to understand exactly how it feels to have 23 years of dedication dismissed as worthless. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Catherine, I understand your feelings, but we typically handle terminations with more discretion than that. I remained firm. Then we don't have an agreement. Marcus made a deliberate choice to humiliate me as publicly as possible. He wanted my colleagues to witness my shame and defeat. I think it's only fair that he experience the same treatment. Another pause, then a sigh. Very well. We'll handle his termination according to your specifications. The conversation ended with the details of my return to Peterson and Associates, scheduled for the following Monday. I would walk back into the office where I'd been humiliated and degraded, this time as Senior Client Relations Manager, with the authority and respect that Marcus had tried to steal from me. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that felt like new beginnings. I dressed carefully for my return, choosing a navy blue suit that projected confidence and authority. I arrived at Peterson and Associates at 7:30, just as I always had, but this time I was escorted to my new office by James Peterson himself. The office was significantly larger than my previous workspace, with windows overlooking the city and furnishings that reflected my elevated status within the firm. At 9 o'clock, I heard the commotion from the main floor. Raised voices, the sound of items being hastily packed, the unmistakable presence of security personnel. I couldn't resist walking to my window, which provided a clear view of the parking lot below. Within minutes, I saw Marcus Wellington emerge from the building, carrying a cardboard box and flanked by 2 security guards. His face was flushed with embarrassment and anger. His carefully styled hair was disheveled. His expensive suit looked rumpled and defeated. From my new office, I watched as he fumbled with his car keys, dropped his box of personal belongings, and struggled to maintain any semblance of dignity while his former colleagues observed his departure from the building's windows. It was exactly the kind of public humiliation he'd orchestrated for me 3 weeks earlier, and I felt no guilt about ensuring he experienced the same treatment. My phone rang, interrupting my observation of Marcus's departure. It was Linda Morrison, the client who'd called to express concern about the transition to Marcus's management. Catherine, I just heard the wonderful news that you're back at Peterson and Associates. I can't tell you how relieved I am. The past few weeks have been incredibly frustrating, and I was seriously considering finding a new firm. But knowing you're back gives me confidence that we can get my portfolio management back on track. Similar calls came throughout the day. Client after client expressed relief, gratitude, and renewed confidence in Peterson and Associates now that I'd returned. The Henderson portfolio review that Marcus had failed to complete was back on schedule. The Johnson tax filing error had been corrected and submitted properly. The Morrison account was secure and satisfied. Within a single day, the department began returning to the efficiency and excellence that had characterized it during my previous tenure. By the end of my first week back, it was clear that my return had solved more than just operational problems. Staff morale had improved dramatically. Client satisfaction scores were rebounding quickly. The partners were expressing renewed confidence in the department's ability to meet performance targets and maintain service standards. Everything that Marcus had disrupted with his arrogance and incompetence was being restored through experience, expertise, and genuine commitment to excellence. The irony wasn't lost on me as I settled into my new role. Marcus had eliminated my position because he'd viewed me as outdated, irrelevant, and expendable. But his failure had proven exactly the opposite. My methods weren't antiquated. They were effective. My approaches weren't obsolete. They were reliable. My value wasn't diminished by my age. it was enhanced by my experience. 3 months into my return, I received an unexpected email from Marcus Wellington. The subject line read, "Professional Inquiry," and the message was brief but revealing. He was writing to ask if I might serve as a reference for a position he was pursuing at another accounting firm. He acknowledged that our professional relationship had ended on difficult terms, but he hoped I might be willing to provide a positive recommendation based on his potential rather than his recent performance. I stared at the email for a long time, considering how to respond. The man who'd called me deadweight was now asking me to vouch for his professional capabilities. The person who'd orchestrated my public humiliation was now requesting my assistance in rebuilding his career. The irony was almost too perfect to ignore. In the end, I responded with perfect professional courtesy and devastating honesty. I acknowledged his request, thanked him for thinking of me as a potential reference, and politely declined to provide a recommendation. I explained that my commitment to professional integrity prevented me from endorsing candidates whose capabilities I couldn't confidently support based on direct observation of their performance. The response was diplomatic, professional, and completely destructive to his prospects. Any potential employer who received such a carefully worded non-recommendation would understand exactly what it meant. I wasn't willing to speak positively about his abilities, which told them everything they needed to know about his likely performance in their organization. 6 months after my return to Peterson and Associates, I was recognized as Employee of the Year, an honor I'd never received despite my decades of service to the firm. The award ceremony included testimonials from clients, colleagues, and partners about my contributions to the organization's success. James Peterson spoke about the importance of experience, wisdom, and institutional knowledge in maintaining excellence. The entire event felt like a celebration not just of my individual achievements, but of the value of seasoned professionals in an increasingly youth-obsessed business culture. As I stood at the podium accepting the award, I looked out at my colleagues and reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months earlier, I'd been humiliated, terminated, and dismissed as irrelevant. Today, I was being celebrated as indispensable. The difference hadn't been a transformation in my capabilities, or an improvement in my performance. The difference had been the recognition of value that had always existed, but had been temporarily obscured by one person's ambition and short-sightedness. During my acceptance speech, I spoke about the importance of treating all employees with dignity and respect, regardless of their age or length of service. I talked about the value of institutional knowledge and the danger of discarding experience in favor of novelty. I emphasized the importance of building inclusive workplaces where wisdom and innovation could coexist productively. And while I never mentioned Marcus Wellington by name, everyone in the room understood the subtext of my remarks. The real victory wasn't Marcus's termination or my triumphant return. The real victory was the transformation in how Peterson and Associates approached human resources and professional development. New policies were implemented to ensure that termination decisions involved multiple levels of review. Training programs were established to help younger employees understand the value of learning from senior colleagues rather than competing with them. Mentorship initiatives were created to facilitate knowledge transfer between generations of professionals. 1 year after my return, I received a LinkedIn message from a young woman named Jessica Chen who had recently started at another accounting firm in the city. She'd heard about my experience at Peterson and Associates and wanted to share her own story. She'd been working with a senior colleague who reminded her of me. Knowledgeable, generous with guidance, and committed to excellence. But she'd also been feeling pressure from management to prove her own value by distinguishing herself from the older employees in her department. "Reading about your situation made me realize how destructive that mindset could be," she wrote. "Instead of viewing my senior colleagues as obstacles to my advancement, I've started seeing them as resources for my development. I've begun asking questions instead of assuming I already know better. I've started listening instead of just waiting for my turn to speak. And I've discovered that learning from experience doesn't diminish my own potential for innovation. It enhances it." Jessica's message reminded me that my story had reached beyond Peterson and Associates, inspiring other professionals to reconsider their assumptions about age, experience, and value in the workplace. The humiliation Marcus had intended to be the end of my career had instead become the beginning of a new chapter focused on mentorship, advocacy, and positive change within the professional community. Looking back now, I can see that Marcus Wellington did me an unexpected favor. His betrayal forced me to confront my own assumptions about loyalty, job security, and professional relationships. His calculated cruelty taught me valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation and protecting my own interests. His spectacular failure demonstrated that experience and wisdom have enduring value that can't be replicated through ambition alone. The young man who'd once told me my time was up had learned the hard way that time has a way of proving who brings real value to an organization and who simply talks about bringing value. In the end, his time at Peterson & Associates was measured in weeks, while mine continues to be measured in decades. And in a profession where trust, reliability, and expertise matter more than flash and ambition, longevity speaks for itself. As I sit in my office today, mentoring another young professional who reminds me of the person Marcus could have been if he'd chosen collaboration over competition, I'm grateful for every lesson this experience taught me. The difficult moments revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed. The professional setback led to greater opportunities than I'd ever imagined, and the attempt to diminish my value ultimately proved how irreplaceable that value really was. Sometimes the best revenge isn't planning someone's downfall. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being so good at what you do that their absence becomes irrelevant while your presence becomes indispensable. Marcus Wellington learned that lesson the hard way, and I suspect he'll spend the rest of his career trying to rebuild what his arrogance cost him. Meanwhile, I'll continue doing what I've always done, showing up, doing excellent work, and proving that experience never goes out of style. The weeks following my termination from Peterson & Associates blurred together in a haze of rejection letters, sleepless nights, and growing financial anxiety. What I'd initially believed would be a temporary setback was quickly revealing itself as something far more devastating. At 58, I was discovering that the job market had little interest in experienced professionals, regardless of their qualifications or track record. My daily routine had become a soul-crushing cycle of online applications, networking calls, and increasingly desperate attempts to present myself as relevant, in a world that seemed determined to cast me aside. Each morning I would wake up before dawn, not because I had anywhere to go, but because lying in bed gave me too much time to think about how completely my life had unraveled in such a short span of time. The first shock had come during my initial meeting with Rebecca Martinez, a career counselor recommended by my former colleague Sarah. Rebecca specialized in helping mature professionals navigate career transitions, and I'd hoped she might provide some insight into effective job search strategies for someone in my situation. Instead, she delivered a reality check that left me reeling. "Catherine, I need to be honest with you about the challenges you're facing," Rebecca had said during our consultation at her downtown office. Her tone was kind but unflinchingly direct. "The current job market is extremely difficult for professionals over 55, particularly in fields like accounting where employers often prioritize cost savings over experience. You're going to encounter age discrimination, though it will rarely be explicit or legally actionable." She'd pulled out a folder containing statistics that painted a grim picture of my prospects. The average job search for professionals in my age group lasted 8 to 12 months, assuming they found employment at all. Many companies used automated screening systems that filtered out candidates based on graduation dates, length of experience, or salary requirements that suggested seniority. Even when applications made it through initial screenings, hiring managers often had unconscious biases against older candidates. "The key is positioning yourself strategically," Rebecca had continued. "You'll need to modernize your resume format, emphasize technology skills, and consider removing some of your earlier work experience to avoid age-based assumptions. You might also want to think about accepting positions at lower levels or with reduced compensation, at least initially. The idea of hiding my experience or accepting a demotion after 23 years of professional growth felt like betraying everything I'd worked to achieve." But as the weeks passed and my savings account dwindled, I began to understand that pride might be a luxury I couldn't afford. The mortgage on my small house wasn't going to pay itself, and my health insurance through Cobra was costing more per month than I'd ever imagined possible. My first real interview came 6 weeks after my termination, with a regional accounting firm called Bradley & Associates. The position was for a senior accountant role, technically a step down from my previous responsibilities, but the salary was reasonable, and the company had a good reputation in the local business community. I'd spent hours preparing, researching the firm's client base, practicing answers to common interview questions, and selecting an outfit that projected competence without suggesting that I might be overqualified or expensive. The interview was conducted by David Bradley himself, a man roughly my age who'd founded the firm 15 years earlier. I'd felt cautiously optimistic during our conversation. He'd seemed impressed by my experience, asked thoughtful questions about my approach to client relationship management, and nodded approvingly when I described some of the complex projects I'd handled at Peterson & Associates. When he'd mentioned that they were looking for someone who could provide stability and institutional knowledge to their growing team, I'd felt like I was exactly what they needed. "Catherine, I have to say your qualifications are impressive," David had said as our meeting concluded. "You clearly have the expertise we're looking for, and your client references are outstanding. I'll be making a decision within the next few days, and I'll definitely be in touch either way." The handshake had been firm, the eye contact confident, and I'd left his office feeling more hopeful than I had since my termination. The rejection call came 3 days later. David's assistant, speaking in the carefully neutral tone that job seekers learn to dread, informed me that they'd decided to go with another candidate whose background was a better fit for their current needs. When I'd asked for feedback that might help me in future applications, she'd offered only vague platitudes about it being a competitive process and wished me luck in my search. It was Sarah who eventually told me the real reason I hadn't gotten the job. She'd run into David Bradley at a professional networking event and had mentioned that she knew I was interviewing with his firm. His response had been revealing in its honesty. "Catherine seems like a wonderful person with impressive experience, but we were concerned about cultural fit. Our team skews pretty young, and we worried that someone with her level of experience might have trouble adapting to our more casual, collaborative environment. We also thought she might get bored with the day-to-day responsibilities, or expect more authority than we were prepared to offer." The translation was clear. I was too old, too experienced, and too likely to challenge their existing dynamics. Despite my qualifications, despite my enthusiasm for the role, despite my willingness to take a step back in responsibility, I was perceived as a threat rather than an asset. The very experience that should have made me valuable was being used as evidence that I wouldn't fit in. The pattern repeated itself over the following months. Interviews that seemed promising would end with polite rejections for vague reasons. Companies that had seemed interested based on my resume would suddenly discover that my qualifications weren't quite what they were looking for. Hiring managers who'd been enthusiastic during phone screenings would become noticeably cooler during in-person meetings, as if seeing my actual age had changed their entire perception of my candidacy. The worst interview had been with a startup that provided financial consulting services to small businesses. The founders were both in their early 30s, and the entire staff appeared to be under 40. I'd known from the moment I walked into their ultra-modern office space, with its open floor plan, standing desks, and abundance of houseplants, that I was out of place. But I'd persevered through the interview process, trying to demonstrate that I could adapt to their culture while bringing valuable experience to their team. "So Catherine," one of the founders had said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, "tell us about your experience with social media marketing and digital client acquisition strategies." I'd explained that while those weren't areas of specialization for me, I was eager to learn and had been taking online courses to develop contemporary marketing skills. The exchange of glances between the two founders had been subtle but unmistakable. I was already behind before the interview had really begun. "What about your familiarity with cloud-based accounting platforms and artificial intelligence tools for financial analysis?" the other founder had asked. Again, I'd admitted that my experience was primarily with more traditional systems, but I'd emphasized my adaptability and willingness to embrace new technologies. Their subsequent questions had felt more like tests designed to highlight my deficiencies than genuine attempts to assess my potential contributions. The interview had concluded with them asking about my long-term career goals and whether I might find their fast-paced, constantly evolving environment challenging after years in more established corporate settings. It was a polite way of suggesting that I was too set in my ways to thrive in their dynamic workplace. The rejection email had arrived the next morning, thanking me for my interest and wishing me well in my future endeavors. As my job search stretched into its 4th month, I began to confront the possibility that I might never find another position comparable to what I'd lost at Peterson & Associates. The financial pressure was becoming acute. My savings were dwindling rapidly, consumed by mortgage payments, insurance premiums, and basic living expenses. I'd already canceled cable television, reduced my grocery budget to essentials, and postponed necessary home repairs. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle I'd built over decades of steady employment was eroding with frightening speed. My daughter Elena had begun dropping hints about financial assistance, offering to help with my mortgage payments, or suggesting that I might want to consider moving in with her family temporarily. Her concern was touching, but the idea of becoming financially dependent on my children at this stage of my life felt like a fundamental failure. I'd raised Elena to be independent and self-sufficient. Now I was facing the prospect of reversing those roles in ways that challenged my entire sense of identity and self-worth. The emotional toll was perhaps even more devastating than the financial pressure. I'd spent my entire adult life defining myself through my professional achievements and contributions. My work at Peterson & Associates hadn't just been a job. It had been a source of purpose, identity, and social connection. Without those daily interactions, challenging projects, and sense of professional accomplishment, I felt increasingly isolated and irrelevant. My social life had largely revolved around work relationships and professional activities. Colleagues who had been friends gradually stopped calling as the months passed. Professional networking events became exercises in maintaining dignity, while explaining my prolonged unemployment to increasingly uncomfortable contacts. Even casual social interactions became minefields, where simple questions like "how's work going?" could trigger waves of shame and embarrassment. The psychological impact of prolonged unemployment was something I'd never fully understood before experiencing it personally. Each rejection felt like a personal judgment of my worth and competence. Each day without meaningful professional activity chipped away at my confidence and sense of purpose. I began to question not just my marketability but my fundamental value as a human being. If employers consistently found me lacking, perhaps Marcus Wellington had been right about my obsolescence. Sleep became elusive as my mind raced through endless scenarios of financial ruin and professional irrelevance. I would lie awake calculating how long my savings might last, imagining conversations with creditors, and trying to envision alternative futures that seemed increasingly bleak. The stress manifested physically in headaches, digestive problems, and a persistent fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to alleviate. My health insurance situation added another layer of anxiety to an already overwhelming situation. The COBRA coverage that allowed me to maintain my previous benefits was prohibitively expensive and temporary. I spent countless hours researching alternatives through the health insurance marketplace, comparing deductibles and coverage options that all seemed designed to provide minimal protection at maximum cost. The realization that a serious illness or injury could financially destroy me added urgency to my job search while simultaneously undermining my ability to present myself as confident and capable during interviews. It was during this darkest period that I began to notice things about my former workplace that I'd been too distraught to observe immediately after my termination. The first sign came through my continued friendship with Jennifer, the junior analyst I'd been mentoring before my dismissal. She'd reached out periodically to check on my well-being, and during one of our coffee meetings she'd mentioned some concerning developments at Peterson & Associates. "Things have been really chaotic since you left," Jennifer had confided, stirring her latte nervously. "Marcus is completely overwhelmed. He's working 12-hour days and weekends, but he still can't keep up with everything. The Henderson account that you used to manage so smoothly has become a disaster. Marcus missed 2 important deadlines, and the client is furious. They've already had one meeting with the partners to complain about the decline in service quality." She'd continued with a litany of problems that Marcus was struggling to address. Client relationships that had been carefully cultivated over years were deteriorating under his impersonal management style. Projects that I'd handled efficiently were taking him twice as long to complete, and the quality of his work was inconsistent at best. Other staff members were being asked to cover gaps in his performance, creating resentment and additional workload pressures throughout the department. "The partners are starting to ask questions," Jennifer had said quietly. "They keep comparing how things used to run when you were there versus how they're operating now. I heard Mr. Peterson telling another partner that eliminating your position might have been premature. He seemed really frustrated about the client complaints and the overtime costs they're incurring to cover Marcus's shortcomings." This information had provided a small measure of validation during a period when I'd been questioning my own professional value. The struggles Marcus was experiencing weren't just due to the learning curve associated with expanded responsibilities. They were evidence that the experience and expertise I'd brought to Peterson and Associates had been more valuable than he'd recognized or admitted. The institutional knowledge, client relationships, and operational efficiency that had characterized my tenure couldn't be replicated through ambition and graduate school credentials alone. Over the following weeks, I learned more about the mounting problems at my former workplace through my network of contacts within the firm. Sarah from payroll mentioned that several long-term clients had expressed dissatisfaction with the transition to Marcus's management. David from accounts receivable reported that Marcus had made several billing errors that required extensive corrections. Even the office manager had commented on the increased stress levels and overtime hours that had become necessary to maintain basic service standards. The most significant revelation came through an unexpected source. Margaret Walsh, a client whose account I'd managed for over a decade, called me at home one evening. She'd obtained my personal number from a mutual contact and wanted to discuss her growing frustrations with Peterson and Associates. "Catherine, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly, but I'm at my wit's end with this Marcus fellow who's supposed to be handling my affairs now," she'd said, her usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious irritation. Margaret's account was one of the firm's largest and most profitable, involving complex trust management and estate planning that required intimate knowledge of her family's financial situation and long-term goals. I'd worked with her for years to develop strategies that balanced tax efficiency with her philanthropic interests and legacy planning objectives. The relationship had been built on mutual respect, trust, and deep understanding of her unique circumstances. "Marcus doesn't seem to understand the foundation we've built together," Margaret had continued. "He keeps suggesting changes to strategies that we've carefully developed over years of collaboration. When I try to explain the reasoning behind our current approach, he dismisses my concerns and insists that his methods are more modern and effective. But he doesn't understand the nuances of my situation or the careful balance we've achieved between my various financial goals." She'd gone on to describe a series of interactions with Marcus that revealed his fundamental inability to provide the personalized, relationship-based service that had characterized my approach to client management. He'd missed important deadlines related to her charitable giving, failed to coordinate effectively with her other professional advisors, and demonstrated a concerning lack of familiarity with the tax strategies we'd implemented to optimize her estate planning. "I've been a client of Peterson and Associates for over 15 years, and I've never been this dissatisfied with the quality of service," Margaret had said. "If things don't improve dramatically and quickly, I'm going to have to consider moving my business elsewhere. And frankly, I'd want you to handle my account wherever you end up working next." This conversation had been both gratifying and troubling. Gratifying because it confirmed that my value to clients had been real and irreplaceable. Troubling because it suggested that Peterson and Associates was at risk of losing significant revenue due to Marcus's inadequate performance. Margaret's account alone generated substantial fees for the firm, and losing it would have serious financial implications for the partners. More importantly, Margaret's call had planted the seed of an idea that would eventually transform my understanding of my situation and my options for moving forward. If established clients were dissatisfied with the service they were receiving at Peterson and Associates, and if they would prefer to work with me regardless of where I was employed, perhaps I had more leverage and more alternatives than I'd realized. The idea of starting my own practice had never seriously occurred to me before my termination. I'd always viewed myself as an employee rather than an entrepreneur, someone who preferred the security and structure of working within an established organization. But as I reflected on Margaret's words and the broader pattern of client dissatisfaction that was emerging at Peterson and Associates, I began to consider whether striking out on my own might be not just possible, but potentially more rewarding than trying to find another traditional employment opportunity. The more I researched the possibility of independent practice, the more feasible it seemed. I had the necessary certifications and professional credentials. I had extensive experience with all aspects of accounting and financial management. Most importantly, I had relationships with clients who valued my expertise and trusted my judgment. The main barriers were financial startup costs and the psychological challenge of abandoning the security of employment for the uncertainty of entrepreneurship. My exploration of independent practice coincided with continued revelations about the deteriorating situation at Peterson & Associates. Through my network of contacts, I learned that Marcus had made a serious error in a major client's quarterly tax filing, resulting in penalties and interest charges that the firm would have to cover. He'd also mishandled a delicate client relationship issue, causing a longtime account to threaten legal action over what they perceived as negligent advice. The partners were reportedly conducting emergency meetings to address the mounting problems in the department. There was talk of hiring additional staff to support Marcus, of bringing in external consultants to review client relationships, and of implementing new oversight procedures to prevent further errors. All of these measures would increase costs and reduce the profitability that had supposedly justified my elimination in the first place. It was during this period of growing awareness about Marcus's failures and increasing consideration of independent practice that I received an unexpected phone call that would change the trajectory of my entire situation. The caller identified himself as Robert Chen, a partner at Chen & Associates, a boutique accounting firm that specialized in serving high-net-worth individuals and small businesses. He'd heard about my departure from Peterson & Associates through professional networks and wanted to discuss a potential opportunity. "Catherine, I've been hearing some interesting things about changes at Peterson & Associates, and your name keeps coming up in conversations about quality professionals who might be available for new opportunities." Robert had said during our initial phone conversation, "I'd like to meet with you to discuss a potential partnership arrangement that might be mutually beneficial." The meeting was scheduled for the following week at Chen & Associates, offices in an upscale business district downtown. The firm occupied the top floor of a converted historic building, with elegant conference rooms and spectacular city views. Robert Chen was a distinguished man in his early 60s, who'd built his practice over 3 decades of serving clients who valued personalized attention and expert advice over cost savings and efficiency. "Catherine, I'll be direct about why I wanted to meet with you," Robert had said after we'd settled into his office overlooking the city center. "I've been watching the situation at Peterson & Associates with great interest, particularly the challenges they're experiencing since your departure. Several of their clients have approached me about potentially moving their business, and your name comes up consistently as the person they wish they could continue working with." He'd explained that Chen & Associates was structured as a partnership of independent practitioners who shared resources and overhead costs while maintaining autonomy over their individual client relationships. Partners brought their own clients and expertise to the firm, while benefiting from shared administrative support, office space, and professional development resources. It was a model that combined the independence of solo practice with the stability and resources of a larger organization. "I'd like to propose that you join us as a partner," Robert had continued. "You would bring your expertise and client relationships, and we would provide the infrastructure and support to help you build an independent practice within our collaborative framework. The financial arrangement would be significantly more favorable than traditional employment, since you'd be sharing in the profits generated by your own work rather than receiving a fixed salary." The proposal was intriguing on multiple levels. It would allow me to escape the age discrimination and limited opportunities of the traditional job market, while building something that belonged to me, rather than to an employer who might decide to eliminate my position on a whim. It would also enable me to provide the kind of personalized, relationship-based service that clients like Margaret Walsh were seeking but couldn't find at firms focused primarily on cost efficiency and profit maximization. The partnership arrangement would require me to bring a certain number of clients with me to ensure immediate revenue generation. This requirement had initially seemed like a potential obstacle, but as I considered the conversations I'd had with former Peterson & Associates clients, I began to realize that it might be less challenging than I'd assumed. Margaret Walsh had already expressed interest in following me wherever I went. Other clients had made similar comments during our interactions since my termination. Robert had given me 2 weeks to consider his proposal and to assess whether I could generate sufficient client interest to make the partnership viable. The timeline was tight, but it also created urgency that forced me to move beyond theoretical consideration to practical action. I would need to contact former clients directly, gauge their interest in switching firms, and determine whether I could build a sustainable practice around their business. The first call was to Margaret Walsh, who responded with immediate enthusiasm. "Catherine, this is wonderful news. I've been hoping you'd find a way to start your own practice. I would absolutely move my business to work with you again. In fact, I've been delaying several important decisions because I wasn't confident in the advice I was receiving from Marcus. When can we schedule a meeting to discuss the transition?" Similar responses came from other former clients as I worked through my contact list. The Henderson account that Jennifer had mentioned was experiencing problems, expressed immediate interest in switching. The Morrison family, whose complex estate planning I'd managed for years, was eager to resume working with me. Even some smaller accounts that I'd served at Peterson & Associates were willing to move their business to maintain our professional relationship. Within a week, I had commitments from clients representing more than enough revenue to meet Chen & Associates' partnership requirements. The response was so positive that I began to understand how significantly my departure had impacted not just Peterson & Associates' operational efficiency, but their client satisfaction and retention. The relationships I'd built over years of dedicated service were proving to be more valuable and more portable than I'd ever imagined. The decision to accept Robert Chen's partnership offer was ultimately easy, despite the fear and uncertainty that accompanied any major life change. The alternative was continuing to search for traditional employment in a market that had consistently demonstrated its lack of interest in mature professionals. The partnership offered autonomy, financial upside, and the opportunity to work with clients who valued my expertise rather than viewing my experience as a liability. My last conversation with Marcus Wellington before joining Chen & Associates came through an unexpected encounter at a downtown coffee shop. I'd been meeting with a potential new client when I'd spotted him at a corner table, looking haggard and stressed in ways that were strikingly different from the confident young professional who'd orchestrated my termination 6 months earlier. When our eyes met, he'd approached my table with an expression that mixed embarrassment with what might have been desperation. "Catherine, I'm glad I ran into you," he'd said, though his body language suggested he was anything but glad. "I wanted to apologize for how things ended at Peterson & Associates. I realize now that I may have been hasty in my assessment of the situation. The transition has been more challenging than I anticipated, and I've gained a new appreciation for the complexity of what you were managing." His apology was carefully worded, probably crafted after consultation with legal counsel or career advisors. But beneath the diplomatic language, I could hear genuine distress. The confident young man who'd dismissed my contributions as outdated was now struggling with responsibilities he'd convinced management he could handle with ease. The very complexity he'd underestimated was overwhelming him daily. "I heard you're starting your own practice," he'd continued. "I hope there are no hard feelings about what happened. Maybe we could even collaborate on some projects in the future, once things settle down." The suggestion was so tone-deaf, so oblivious to the magnitude of what he'd done, that I'd almost laughed. The man who'd publicly humiliated me and stolen my livelihood was now suggesting professional collaboration, as if we were simply former colleagues who'd had a minor disagreement. "Marcus, I appreciate your apology," I'd replied, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "But I think it's best if we keep our professional paths separate going forward. I'm sure you'll figure out how to manage your responsibilities at Peterson & Associates." The conversation had ended there, with Marcus nodding awkwardly and returning to his table where he'd sat staring at his laptop with the expression of someone drowning in obligations he couldn't fulfill. That encounter had provided a satisfying sense of closure to the most difficult chapter of my professional life. The man who'd called me deadweight was now struggling with work that I'd handled smoothly for years. The person who'd questioned my relevance was now discovering exactly how relevant my contributions had been. The individual who'd engineered my departure was now experiencing the consequences of his own short-sightedness and overconfidence. More importantly, the contrast between his obvious distress and my growing excitement about the future highlighted how completely the situation had reversed. 6 months earlier, I'd been the one facing uncertainty and professional catastrophe. Now I was preparing to launch an independent practice with established clients, guaranteed revenue, and unlimited potential for growth. The victim had become the victor, not through revenge or manipulation, but through the simple process of demonstrating value that couldn't be replicated or replaced. As I prepared for my new role at Chen & Associates, I reflected on the lessons I'd learned during the most challenging period of my professional life. The job market's age discrimination had been real and painful, but it had ultimately forced me to consider alternatives that offered greater rewards than traditional employment. The financial pressure and emotional stress had been overwhelming at times, but they had also clarified my priorities and strengthened my resolve. Most importantly, I'd learned that my value as a professional wasn't dependent on any single employer's recognition or appreciation. The clients who'd followed me from Peterson and Associates, the partners at Chen and Associates who'd recruited me, and the new clients who were already expressing interest in my services, all confirmed that experience, expertise, and relationship-building skills remained valuable in a marketplace that often prioritized novelty over substance. The transformation from unemployed older worker to successful independent practitioner hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. But it had been possible because I'd eventually recognized that my termination from Peterson and Associates wasn't the end of my career. It was the beginning of a new chapter that would ultimately prove more rewarding and more sustainable than anything I'd achieved as someone else's employee. The young man who'd told me my time was up had inadvertently given me the push I needed to discover opportunities I'd never have pursued otherwise. His attempt to end my career had actually liberated me to build something better. And as I looked forward to my first day as a partner at Chen and Associates, I realized that sometimes the best revenge is simply proving that your value transcends anyone else's ability to recognize or appreciate it. My first day as a partner at Chen and Associates began with a sunrise that painted the city skyline in shades of gold and amber. I arrived at the office building 45 minutes early, not from nervousness but from excitement that had made sleep impossible. The contrast with my final morning at Peterson and Associates couldn't have been more stark. Instead of carrying a cardboard box filled with discarded belongings, I was arriving with a briefcase full of client files and partnership agreements that represented a new beginning built on my own terms. The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave me time to reflect on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred over the past 8 months. The woman who had been publicly humiliated and dismissed as obsolete was now a full equity partner in a prestigious firm, bringing with her a portfolio of clients that represented over $2 million in annual revenue. The financial security that had been stripped away by Marcus Wellington's betrayal had been replaced by something far more valuable: ownership of my own professional destiny. Robert Chen greeted me personally in the reception area, a gesture of respect that immediately established the tone of our partnership. His firm handshake and genuine smile conveyed the kind of professional recognition I'd been missing since my termination. We walked together through the elegantly appointed offices, past conference rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows and individual partner offices that reflected the success and dignity of independent practice. My new office was corner space with panoramic views of the downtown district and the mountains beyond. The mahogany desk and leather furnishings spoke to the firm's commitment to projecting success and stability to clients who expected their financial advisors to demonstrate prosperity through their professional environment. But more than the physical trappings, what struck me was the nameplate on the door: Catherine Rivera, CPA, partner. After decades of being someone else's employee, seeing my name displayed with such authority felt revolutionary. The morning was devoted to administrative orientation and meetings with key staff members who would support my practice within the firm's collaborative structure. Unlike the chaotic environment I'd left at Peterson and Associates, Chen and Associates operated with the kind of systematic efficiency that comes from having experienced professionals who understand the importance of detailed planning and careful execution. Every aspect of client service, from initial consultation to ongoing relationship management, was designed to exceed expectations rather than merely meet minimum standards. My first client meeting as a partner was scheduled for 10 o'clock with Margaret Walsh, whose immediate enthusiasm for my new venture had provided the foundation for everything that followed. She arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed and carrying the thick portfolio of financial documents that represented years of collaborative planning. The reunion was warm but professional, acknowledging both our personal connection and the serious business we needed to address. "Catherine, I cannot tell you how relieved I am to be working with you again," Margaret said as we settled into the conference room adjacent to my office. "The past few months have been incredibly frustrating. Marcus simply doesn't understand the complexity of my financial situation, or the careful balance we've achieved between tax efficiency and philanthropic objectives. I've been postponing several major decisions because I didn't trust the advice I was receiving. We spent the next 3 hours reviewing her current financial position, reassessing strategies that had been disrupted during the transition period, and developing an action plan to address opportunities that had been missed during her time with Marcus. The depth of institutional knowledge required to serve her effectively became immediately apparent as we discussed trust structures, estate planning modifications, and charitable giving strategies that built on foundations we'd established over years of collaboration. The technical complexity of Margaret's situation highlighted exactly why Marcus had struggled so dramatically to replace me. Her portfolio wasn't just a collection of accounts and investments. It was an integrated financial ecosystem that reflected her values, family dynamics, business interests, and long-term legacy goals. Understanding how all these elements interconnected required not just technical expertise but intimate knowledge of her personal circumstances and decision-making preferences that couldn't be transferred through file reviews or briefing sessions. By the end of our meeting, Margaret had signed agreements transferring all her accounts from Peterson and Associates to Chen and Associates, a process that would involve moving over $40 million in managed assets. The revenue implications for my new firm were substantial, but the personal satisfaction of restoring a professional relationship that had been severed by Marcus's incompetence was even more meaningful. This wasn't just about business. It was about vindication of the relationship-based approach to client service that he had dismissed as outdated. The afternoon brought meetings with 2 other former Peterson and Associates clients who had expressed interest in following me to my new practice. The Henderson family, whose complex business succession planning had been one of Marcus's most visible failures, arrived with a litany of complaints about missed deadlines, inadequate communication, and strategic recommendations that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of their objectives. Their decision to transfer their business was immediate and unanimous. "Catherine, we should have insisted on working exclusively with you from the beginning," Thomas Henderson said as we concluded our consultation. "The past few months have been a nightmare of confusion and delays. Marcus kept trying to implement changes to strategies that had taken us years to develop, apparently without understanding why we'd made those choices in the first place. We've lost valuable time and opportunities because of his inexperience and arrogance." The Morrison account presented a similar story of frustration and disappointment with Marcus's approach to client service. Their estate planning needs required coordination with attorneys, insurance professionals, and investment advisors in multiple states, a level of complexity that demanded both technical expertise and exceptional organizational skills. Marcus's failure to maintain effective communication among all parties had created confusion and delays that threatened important deadlines and tax optimization opportunities. We kept asking ourselves why we were tolerating such poor service from Peterson and Associates when we knew you were available, Patricia Morrison explained during our meeting. Marcus seemed to view our questions and concerns as challenges to his authority rather than opportunities to provide better service. The contrast with your collaborative approach couldn't be more obvious. By the end of my first week as a partner, I had successfully transferred 7 major accounts from Peterson and Associates to Chen and Associates, representing a total of over $80 million in managed assets. The financial impact on my former employer was immediate and devastating. These weren't marginal clients whose departure might go unnoticed. They were cornerstone accounts that had provided substantial revenue and prestige for the firm over many years. The psychological satisfaction of this client exodus was immense, but it was tempered by a growing awareness of the broader implications of what was happening. Peterson and Associates wasn't just losing revenue, they were losing their reputation for excellence in serving high-net-worth clients. The departure of so many prestigious accounts in such a short time frame would inevitably raise questions among remaining clients about the firm's stability and competence. My success at Chen and Associates was attracting attention throughout the local professional community. Word spread quickly in accounting circles about the experienced partner who had built a thriving practice almost overnight by leveraging client relationships that had been disrupted by poor management decisions at a competing firm. The story became a cautionary tale about the risks of eliminating experienced professionals in favor of less costly but less capable alternatives. 3 weeks into my partnership, I received an unexpected call from James Peterson himself. His voice carried a tone of professional courtesy, but I could detect underlying strain that suggested he was dealing with significant stress. The conversation began with pleasantries about my new venture and congratulations on my apparent success, but quickly moved to the real purpose of his call. "Catherine, I'll be direct about why I'm calling," James said after the initial courtesies. "We're experiencing some challenges in our wealth management division, and I've been wondering if you might be interested in discussing a consulting arrangement that could be mutually beneficial. Your expertise with high net worth clients has clearly been more valuable than we fully appreciated, and we'd like to explore ways to potentially work together again." The irony of receiving a consultation request from the firm that had terminated me just months earlier was almost overwhelming. The same organization that had viewed me as expendable deadweight was now asking for my help in addressing problems created by my elimination. James Peterson was essentially admitting that Marcus's confident assurances about his ability to absorb my responsibilities had proven to be catastrophically wrong. "James, I appreciate you reaching out," I replied carefully, "but I'm fully committed to building my practice here at Chen & Associates. I don't think a consulting arrangement would be appropriate given our current competitive relationship." I kept my tone professional and cordial, but the message was clear. Peterson & Associates had made their choice, and now they would have to live with the consequences. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with James making increasingly generous offers for my consulting services. He mentioned hourly rates that exceeded what I had earned as a full-time employee, flexible scheduling that would accommodate my partner responsibilities, and even the possibility of a more permanent arrangement if the consulting relationship proved successful. Each offer only reinforced how desperately they needed my expertise to address the crisis that Marcus's failures had created. "I understand your position," James said finally, his voice betraying frustration that his generous offers had been declined. "But I hope you'll keep the door open for future conversations. The situation here has become quite challenging, and your knowledge of our client base and systems could be invaluable in helping us navigate through these difficulties." After ending the call, I sat in my office contemplating the complete reversal of circumstances that James Peterson's request represented. 8 months earlier, I had been begging for my job, pleading for another chance to prove my value to an organization I had served faithfully for over 2 decades. Now that same organization was pleading with me to rescue them from problems created by their decision to eliminate my position. The validation was profound, but it also highlighted the deeper issues that had led to my termination in the first place. Peterson & Associates hadn't just made a mistake in eliminating my position, they had revealed fundamental flaws in their understanding of what created value in professional service relationships. Their focus on cost reduction over client satisfaction, their preference for credentials over experience, and their willingness to sacrifice proven performance for theoretical efficiencies had created the very crisis they were now asking me to help resolve. My decision to decline their consultation requests wasn't based on vindictiveness or personal animosity. It was a strategic choice rooted in professional ethics and long-term business considerations. My former clients had trusted me enough to follow me to a new firm, and I had obligations to protect their interests and maintain the confidentiality of their affairs. Consulting for Peterson & Associates would create conflicts of interest that could compromise my ability to serve my current clients effectively. More importantly, accepting a consulting role would have undermined the very principle that had driven my decision to leave traditional employment behind. I had joined Chen & Associates specifically to escape the vulnerability of working for organizations that might decide my services were expendable whenever economic pressures or management changes occurred. Building an independent practice meant accepting full responsibility for my professional success. But it also meant never again being subject to the arbitrary decisions of employers who didn't understand or appreciate my contributions. The weeks following James Peterson's call brought a steady stream of similar requests from other accounting firms in the region. Word had spread about my successful transition to independent practice and my apparent ability to attract and retain high-value clients. Several firms expressed interest in acquiring my practice outright, while others proposed partnership arrangements or consulting relationships that would leverage my client relationships and expertise. Each inquiry represented both an opportunity and a validation of the value that Marcus Wellington had dismissed so contemptuously. The very experience in client relationships that he had characterized as obsolete were now being recognized throughout the professional community as valuable assets that could enhance any firm's competitive position. The irony wasn't lost on me that my supposed irrelevance had become the foundation for what was rapidly becoming one of the most successful client acquisition stories in the local accounting market. But the most satisfying validation came through direct feedback from the clients who had chosen to follow me to Chen & Associates. Their relief at resuming effective professional relationships was palpable in every interaction. Complex projects that had stalled under Marcus's management were completed efficiently and successfully. Strategic planning initiatives that had been derailed by his inexperience were back on track with clear timelines and achievable objectives. Margaret Walsh's quarterly review meeting provided a perfect example of how dramatically service quality had improved since leaving Peterson & Associates. We spent 2 hours reviewing her investment performance, discussing tax optimization strategies, and planning charitable giving initiatives for the upcoming year. The conversation was detailed, collaborative, and productive in ways that highlighted the depth of institutional knowledge that Marcus had never developed, despite having access to all her files and financial records. "Catherine, I have to tell you that working with you again has been like emerging from a fog," Margaret said as our meeting concluded. I'd forgotten how efficient and effective our collaboration used to be. Marcus never seemed to understand the big picture or how all the different elements of my financial plan fit together. Every conversation with him felt like starting over from the beginning. Similar feedback came from other clients who had experienced the contrast between Marcus's approach and the kind of personalized, relationship-based service I provided. The difference wasn't just about technical competence, although that was certainly a factor. It was about understanding that effective client service required building trust through consistent performance, maintaining institutional knowledge about individual circumstances and preferences, and developing strategic recommendations that reflected long-term thinking rather than short-term fixes. 6 months into my partnership at Chen & Associates, I received news that provided the ultimate validation of everything I had accomplished since leaving Peterson & Associates. Sarah from payroll, who had remained a trusted source of information about my former workplace, called with an update that was both shocking and inevitable given what I knew about Marcus's performance struggles. "Catherine, you're not going to believe what happened," Sarah said, her voice mixing excitement with disbelief. "Marcus was terminated yesterday. The partners called an emergency meeting and announced that his employment had been ended immediately due to performance issues and client satisfaction concerns. They had security escort him out of the building just like they did with you, except this time everyone could see that he deserved it." The details that followed painted a picture of catastrophic failure that had finally overwhelmed even the most patient partners at Peterson & Associates. Marcus had lost 3 more major clients during the previous month, including one account that had been with the firm for over 20 years. His billing errors had cost the company tens of thousands of dollars in corrections and penalty payments. Most damaging of all, his poor advice on a complex tax matter had exposed both the client and the firm to potential legal liability that could result in substantial damages. The partners realized that keeping him was more expensive than the cost savings they'd achieved by eliminating your position. Sarah continued. "They've been paying overtime to other staff members to cover his mistakes, dealing with client complaints almost daily, and now they're facing potential litigation because of his incompetence. The whole cost-cutting strategy has backfired completely." But the story became even more satisfying when Sarah described the immediate aftermath of Marcus's termination. The partners had called an all-hands meeting to address the crisis in the wealth management division and announce their plan for moving forward. James Peterson had acknowledged that eliminating my position had been a mistake, and that they were actively recruiting experienced professionals to rebuild client relationships and restore service quality. "Mr. Peterson actually mentioned you by name during the meeting," Sarah reported. "He said that your departure had been handled poorly and that they had underestimated the value of your client relationships and institutional knowledge. He stopped just short of admitting that firing you was the biggest mistake the firm had made in years, but everyone in the room understood what he was really saying." The vindication was complete, but it came too late to matter in any practical sense. Peterson & Associates had learned valuable lessons about the importance of experienced professionals and relationship-based client service. But those lessons had cost them millions in lost revenue, damaged reputation, and legal exposure. The quick fix that Marcus had promised had become an expensive disaster that would take years to fully repair. Meanwhile, my practice at Chen & Associates continued to thrive in ways that exceeded even my most optimistic projections. The clients who had followed me from Peterson & Associates were referring friends and family members who were impressed by the quality of service and attention to detail that characterized our approach. My reputation for excellence was spreading through the high-net-worth community, attracting new clients who valued expertise and relationship building over cost efficiency and technological innovation. The financial rewards of partnership were substantial, but the personal satisfaction of building something that belonged to me was even more meaningful. Every client relationship I developed, every successful project I completed, and every strategic recommendation I implemented contributed to an asset that no employer could eliminate or undervalue. The vulnerability that had characterized my employment relationship with Peterson & Associates had been replaced by the security that comes from owning your own professional destiny. 1 year after joining Chen & Associates, I was invited to speak at a regional conference on professional development for mature workers. The organizers had heard about my successful transition from traditional employment to independent practice and wanted me to share insights that might help other professionals navigate similar career changes. The invitation represented recognition that my story had broader implications beyond my personal circumstances. The presentation I developed focused on the importance of understanding your own value proposition and the dangers of allowing others to define your professional worth. I talked about the need to build portable assets like client relationships, specialized expertise, and professional reputation that could survive employment disruptions. Most importantly, I emphasized that age and experience could be competitive advantages, rather than liabilities for professionals who position themselves strategically and refuse to accept others' assessments of their capabilities. The audience response was enthusiastic and emotional. During the question and answer session, numerous attendees shared their own experiences with age discrimination, unexpected terminations, and struggles to find new opportunities in an increasingly youth-oriented job market. Many expressed gratitude for hearing a success story that demonstrated that professional setbacks could become opportunities for growth and independence. One question came from a woman who had been terminated from her marketing position after 15 years with the same company. Her replacement was a recent college graduate who earned less than half her salary, but who management believed would bring fresh perspectives and digital marketing expertise to the role. She wanted to know how I had found the courage to risk starting my own practice, rather than continuing to search for traditional employment. The truth is that traditional employment had already failed me, I replied. I had given my best efforts to an organization for over 20 years, and they had discarded me the moment someone convinced them that my contributions could be replicated more cheaply. Starting my own practice wasn't really about courage. It was about recognizing that the security I thought I had as an employee was largely illusory. The only real security comes from controlling your own professional destiny. Another audience member asked about the practical challenges of building an independent practice without the infrastructure and resources of a larger organization. I explained how partnership arrangements like mine at Chen & Associates could provide the best of both worlds, the independence of owning your own practice, combined with the support systems and professional resources of an established firm. The key was finding organizations that valued experience and relationship building over cost reduction and efficiency metrics. The most powerful moment of the presentation came when I shared the ultimate irony of Marcus Wellington's story. His attempt to eliminate me as deadweight had actually liberated me to build something far more valuable and secure than anything I had achieved as his employee. His betrayal had forced me to discover capabilities and opportunities that I never would have pursued if he hadn't made my previous situation untenable. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up giving us the greatest gifts, I told the audience. Marcus Wellington thought he was ending my career, but he actually started the best chapter of my professional life. His assessment of my value was so wrong that it forced me to prove him wrong in ways that exceeded my own expectations. The conference presentation led to additional speaking opportunities and consulting requests from organizations interested in developing more effective strategies for managing mature workers and leveraging institutional knowledge. My story had become a case study in the dangers of eliminating experienced professionals and the value of building inclusive workplaces that respected wisdom as much as innovation. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came through a completely unexpected source. 2 years after my departure from Peterson and Associates, I received a LinkedIn message from Jennifer, the junior analyst I had mentored before my termination. She had left Peterson and Associates 6 months after Marcus's firing, frustrated by the chaos and instability that had characterized the firm since my departure. "Catherine, I wanted you to know that everything you taught me about client relationships and professional excellence has been invaluable in my new position," Jennifer wrote. "Watching how you handled your termination and built your own practice taught me more about resilience and professional integrity than any formal training program could have provided. You've been an inspiration not just for mature professionals, but for anyone who believes that doing excellent work and treating people with respect should matter more than politics and cost-cutting." Her message reminded me that the impact of professional setbacks extends far beyond the immediate parties involved. My termination had affected not just me, but all the colleagues who had witnessed it and learned lessons about loyalty, integrity, and the importance of standing up for principles, even when doing so requires personal sacrifice. The way I had responded to betrayal and built something positive from a devastating experience had influenced others in ways I was only beginning to understand. As I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from that humiliating morning when Marcus Wellington had dismissed me as obsolete to my current position as a successful independent practitioner, I realized that the most important lesson hadn't been about professional skills or business strategy. It had been about the importance of never allowing others to define your worth or determine your potential. Marcus had been wrong about almost everything related to my value and capabilities, but his biggest mistake had been assuming that eliminating my position would eliminate my ability to contribute meaningfully to the professional community. He had confused job with identity, employment with value, and position with purpose. By freeing me from those constraints, he had actually enabled me to achieve things that never would have been possible within the limitations of traditional employment. The young man who had told me my time was up had inadvertently taught me that my time was just beginning. His arrogant dismissal of my experience and relationships had forced me to recognize that those very assets were more portable and valuable than I had ever understood. His attempt to replace me had proven that some contributions cannot be replicated, regardless of credentials or ambition. 3 years after my termination from Peterson and Associates, my practice at Chen and Associates had grown to include 15 major clients and over $100 million in managed assets. I had been elected to the partnership board and was recognized throughout the region as one of the leading experts in high-net-worth client service. The revenue I generated exceeded anything I had contributed as an employee, and the satisfaction of building something that belonged to me made every day feel like a professional adventure, rather than just another job. The contrast with Marcus Wellington's trajectory couldn't have been more stark. According to my network of contacts within the local accounting community, he had struggled to find another position after his termination from Peterson and Associates. The reputation he had built through his failures had preceded him to other firms, and his attempts to present himself as a victim of unrealistic expectations had been undermined by the documented evidence of his poor performance and client management failures. When I occasionally encountered former colleagues from Peterson and Associates at professional events, they invariably expressed amazement at how my situation had transformed. Many admitted that they had initially believed Marcus's narrative about my obsolescence and the need for fresh thinking in the wealth management division. My subsequent success had forced them to reconsider their assumptions about age, experience, and the factors that truly drive professional excellence. The firm itself had never fully recovered from the damage caused by Marcus's tenure and my departure. They had eventually hired 2 experienced professionals to handle the responsibilities that I had managed single-handedly. But rebuilding client relationships and institutional knowledge had proven to be a lengthy and expensive process. Several major accounts had been permanently lost, and the firm's reputation in the high-net-worth market had been diminished in ways that would take years to repair. James Peterson had retired earlier than planned, citing health concerns that were widely understood to be related to the stress of managing the crisis that Marcus's hiring and my termination had created. His departure marked the end of an era for Peterson and Associates, and served as a reminder that poor personnel decisions can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate impact on the individuals directly involved. As I sat in my office on the third anniversary of my termination, looking out at the city skyline that had witnessed my complete professional transformation, I felt gratitude for every difficult moment that had brought me to this point. The humiliation, the financial pressure, the uncertainty, and the self-doubt had all been necessary elements of a journey that had ultimately led to greater success and satisfaction than I had ever experienced as someone else's employee. The young man who had dismissed me as deadweight had been wrong about everything except one crucial point. My time at Peterson & Associates was indeed up. But rather than ending my career, that termination had begun the most rewarding chapter of my professional life. Sometimes the people who try to destroy us end up showing us exactly how strong we really are, and sometimes the doors that get slammed in our faces lead us to opportunities we never would have discovered otherwise. Marcus Wellington had taught me that professional security comes not from pleasing employers or avoiding confrontation, but from building value that belongs to you rather than to others. His betrayal had forced me to recognize capabilities I had never fully utilized and to pursue opportunities I had never seriously considered. In trying to eliminate me as competition, he had actually created a competitor far more formidable than anything I had been as his colleague. The story of my termination and subsequent success had become something of a legend within the local professional community, shared as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating experienced professionals and an inspirational example of how setbacks can become stepping stones to greater achievements. Young professionals sought my mentorship to learn about client relationship building, while mature workers looked to my example for hope that their experience retained value despite marketplace trends that seemed to favor youth over wisdom. But the most satisfying aspect of my transformation wasn't the financial success or professional recognition, though both were gratifying. It was the knowledge that I had proven wrong every assumption that Marcus Wellington had made about my value, my relevance, and my future potential. His assessment of my capabilities had been so completely incorrect that it had actually freed me to achieve things that exceeded even my own expectations. The man who had told me my time was up had given me the greatest gift of my professional life, the motivation to prove that my time was actually just beginning. His arrogant dismissal had become the foundation for achievements that never would have been possible if he had simply treated me with the respect and recognition that my contributions deserved. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I reflected on how completely the power dynamic between Marcus and me had reversed. He had once held my professional fate in his hands, confident in his ability to eliminate me as an obstacle to his ambitions. Now I held the kind of professional security and autonomy that he would probably never achieve, while he continued to struggle with the consequences of decisions that had revealed the fundamental flaws in his character and judgment. The young man who had been so certain of his superiority had learned that confidence without competence is ultimately destructive, while the woman he had dismissed as obsolete had proven that experience combined with determination can overcome any professional setback. His time at Peterson & Associates had indeed been brief, while my influence on the professional community continued to grow with each passing year. Sometimes justice comes not through dramatic confrontations or elaborate revenge schemes, but through the simple process of allowing incompetence to reveal itself, while competence builds something lasting and valuable. Marcus Wellington had eliminated himself through his own failures, while I had elevated myself through persistence, excellence, and the kind of relationship-building skills that cannot be taught in business school or acquired through ambition alone. The story that had begun with humiliation and betrayal had ended with vindication and triumph, proving that professional setbacks are often just opportunities for comebacks that exceed anything that might have been possible, without the motivation that comes from being underestimated by people who should have known better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.